Back in 2003, McDonald's, in its infinite wisdom at the time, filed a defamation lawsuit against an Italian food critic named Edoardo Raspelli for likening their burgers to rubber, likening their chips to cardboard, in a review that he wrote about his experience eating at a McDonald's out there. Okay, and in the suit, McDonald's claimed that Raspelli, who to this day is a legendary as one of Italy's top food critics and culinary personalities, had been, quote, clearly defamatory and offensive to McDonald's and to the more than 600,000 Italians who each day freely choose to eat in a McDonald's restaurant. They freely choose to do so, yes. They're enacting their liberty by going to McDonald's. Raspelli was having none of it. He said, quote, I defamed hamburgers, but I have not insulted anyone. Well, thank you for setting those facts straight, Raspelli. The point in raising this within the context of what we're about to discuss here is that far fewer people in the world would have had any clue who on earth Edoardo Raspelli is, had no less this critical review of his experience eating at a McDonald's, right? Had McDonald's, which today is a multinational corporation with a market cap exceeding $220 billion, not filed this laughable suit against this. I mean, this dude, he was like a gnat or a fruit fly that McDonald's could have just swiped from its sleeve if, in fact, this $220 billion corporation wished to regard the man's existence at all, which they probably would have been wise not to do. Just let it go, dude, right? Let sleeping dogs lie. Shh, just, okay, you had your say, and we're just gonna, yeah, okay. So, this came to mind for me when I saw this news that Diddy was suing NBCUniversal and Peacock, and importantly, as we're about to talk about, the production company behind this documentary, which is a company called Ample, for defamation. A $100 million defamation lawsuit Diddy is filing against these entities because his representation believes that Peacock's documentary, which came out last month, it's called The Making of a Bad Boy. It's all about the Diddy case, the 14-page long federal indictment against him, the now more than 40 lawsuits, the separate lawsuits that have been filed against Diddy as well, defames him. To be honest with you, just as I would have had no clue who Edoardo Raspelli is, nor would I have had any clue about the extent to which he disapproved of the chips at McDonald's, I had previously not much interest, I'll say, in watching this documentary. But now, now I got to see it, right? $100 million defamation lawsuit this documentary inspired. See how that works? I've now watched this documentary about 5 times in preparation for this video. That wouldn't have happened had Diddy just let the facts play out in court and allow his innocence, if indeed he believes himself to be innocent, be established there. But no, here he comes with his $100 million defamation lawsuit. And of course, NBC and Peacock had to rush out and throw this documentary together in the span of just a few months, it seems. After the indictment comes out and there's the raid at Diddy's home and everything. I mean, all of this happened still relatively recently, within the past 6 months. And it's important to note that this production company is also part of the deal, because as we're about to see, there are questions about how many hats they were asked to wear as they were putting this documentary together. One wonders if they were asked to go to lengths that perhaps they weren't prepared to go. If more could have been done to support and corroborate the claims that they unearthed through their interviews with various relevant figures. Now, civil attorney Ariel Mitchell Kidd came out and described Diddy's suit as, quote, a pathetic ploy to silence victims and people who stand up for victims. Now, Ariel Mitchell Kidd also is the person who provoked quite a bit of ire in the Sean Combs camp for describing him as, quote, the embodiment of Lucifer in the documentary. And that is a statement that this defamation suit by Combs' legal team specifically quotes. So they were not too happy about this analogy that she makes between Sean Combs and, Satan. And this isn't the end of it with respect to Diddy documentaries. Apparently, Netflix is reportedly working on another Diddy documentary, this one with the involvement, reportedly, of Combs' longtime adversary, 50 Cent. One wonders how much stomach Netflix is going to have at this point to proceed with that project. Not only in light of the Diddy suit, but as those who visit The Curious Listener know, also in light of the fiasco that resulted from their decision to cancel the 9-hour-long Prince documentary by Ezra Edelman because the Prince estate leaned on them hard and deemed the documentary to be salacious, and therefore successfully got the documentary canceled, likely never to see the light of day. And now the Prince estate is coming up with their own documentary, which I'm sure will be riveting and very, very, very deep dive into all the truth about Prince from the Prince estate. A couple key points that I want to make up front about this Diddy documentary. Have you seen it, by the way? It's the kind of thing that definitely ought to come with a trigger warning. This is one of the darkest and most profoundly disturbing documentaries I have ever watched in my life. There are a couple of victims of Diddy's interviewed in this documentary whose emotional testimony is nothing short of gut-wrenching. Okay, this is dark, dark stuff that paints a portrait of a man who was an outright monster. And if Diddy is convicted of the charges in the federal indictment, in these 40 lawsuits separately filed against him, I mean, it's going to establish him as one of the most despicable human beings walking the face of this earth. That is how terrible the things that this documentary and those indictments and lawsuits reveal about Diddy. And I'll link to that federal indictment in the description of this video, by the way, so you can read it for yourself. At the very least, one can say that Diddy has a very steep uphill battle ahead if this man is ever again going to experience freedom. Now, all of that said, one question I have for NBC and other outlets that are currently working on documentaries about Diddy is, why not wait until after the man is convicted? And the likelihood of that would seem to be somewhat great, given the volume of lawsuits and indictments that have been filed against the man, right? That way, if he's convicted in a court of law, I mean, won't it just be as buzzworthy a topic once news of his conviction comes out, right? It's not like people are suddenly going to have, lost their capacity to care about it. In fact, it'll be reignited by that news. And then jump in and in 3 or 4 months scramble together this documentary and put it out. Fine. It seems to me that the wisdom of that, makes it safer legally, put some parameters around the claims you confidently can make about Diddy and verify. Thanks to his conviction in court, you'll have much more testimony, the revelation of a great deal more evidence on the record in a courtroom. Judges looked at it. Judges determined based on that evidence that if in fact he ultimately is convicted, that he's guilty of the charges against him. But instead, this documentary itself actually stipulates at the very start that they immediately set to work, NBC and Peacock did, in collaboration with Ample Productions. They immediately set to work after last September, after Diddy is this indictment is filed against him and he's thrown in jail. They actually say at the beginning that this documentary crew, right after Diddy's arrest last September, contacted some of his closest friends to get insight on who Sean was and who he is now, which is a contrast that the documentary works somewhat hard to establish. Diddy was a certain person as a kid, and he became, as his friend, very interesting, really, really fascinating guy, and I think possibly the most authentic voice in the whole film. This childhood friend of his named Tim Patterson says that Diddy was monsterized over the course of his life. So you wonder, why the rush? Diddy's legal representation makes a couple claims that seem to some extent be inspired by the very question I just asked. They say things like, well, they just, NBC and Peacock wanted to line their own pockets. This is a direct quote, at the expense of truth, decency, and basic standards of professional journalism. They further allege that NBC, Universal, Peacock, and Ample, quote, seek only to capitalize on the public's appetite for scandal without any regard for the truth at the expense of Mr. Combs' right to a fair trial. Now, in fairness, this documentary chronicles plenty of regard for the truth. Again, I've watched it 5 times now, okay? There's plenty of effort in seeking out the truth. But the question is, and the question that those quotes, I think, try to get at, does the film and do its producers do enough to ward off the threat of this kind of lawsuit from Diddy, which they had to have anticipated, right? And I'm not so sure that they did, for reasons I'm about to get into. And this has nothing to do with whether Diddy's guilty of the charges against him or whether, his accusers can be believed or any of that. Yes, I mean, his accusers absolutely are entitled to being believed. I mean, the horrendous things that those who are courageous enough to actually speak out on the record, in some cases in the shadows, with their faces obscured. In another case, on a phone call where a former employee of Diddy's has his voice disguised because he's terrified that they are going to come after him for speaking out. But what this is about is, could the anticipation of a defamation lawsuit like this being as great as it had to have been, you would think that would compel the people producing this documentary to do absolutely everything they possibly could conceive of to nail down, to corroborate, or to debunk, if that's where the evidence leads them, to do some more with respect to actual independent investigative journalism by NBC itself, which certainly has a great investigative journalist at its disposal. Certainly has the resources to hire the best in that game. Could have done more in that regard had they saw fit to do so. And how could they not have seen fit to do so? Certainly they are asking themselves that question now. I would think, unless they just think that airing an allegation and then in the next screen you see, well, there's no evidence to corroborate that, or well, this hasn't been proven in court, is enough, because you see a lot of that in this documentary. Someone says something, in some cases provably reckless and provably false, and which, as I'll get into, or in other cases, people in this documentary will say things that can be given to the characterization of a conspiracy theory or whatever. And all NBC does is in the next screen they'll say, well, this hasn't been proven, or there's no evidence to document this, or and it's like, is that enough? I mean, even starting with this relatively benign language about how they went out and found some of Diddy's closest friends. Well, what that language ignores is that the documentary crew also succeeded in contacting some of his fiercest critics, people who have very legitimate, very personal beefs with Diddy. One of those people is this guy named Jason Swain, whose brother Dirk was crushed to death at a December 28th, 1991 City College in New York event that was a charity basketball game supposed to feature LL Cool J, Mike Tyson, and others, with the funds going to an AIDS foundation. Diddy oversold this, the film alleges, this 2,700-seat venue at City College. At one point, another guy named Sonny Williams describes the promotional efforts as having been more appropriate to an arena that might have sat 10,000, not 2,700. And this causes a trampling incident in which 9 people, horrifyingly, get crushed to death. Well, one of those people was Jason Swain's brother Dirk, and Jason Swain is a prolific voice throughout this film. Sonny Williams, I just mentioned. Well, guess what? His sister Sonia also was trampled to death and died at this fiasco of a party that Diddy had promoted. Gene Deal, Diddy's former bodyguard from 91 to 2005, who at one point in the film calls him a POS and does so not nearly as kindly as I just did in the film. So, and of course you have accusers and their attorneys, which you're going to have in a documentary like this, right? Obviously, at least those you can find who have the courage to speak out, which I'm sure was no easy task for them either. One interesting revelation that helps you understand the depth of the animosity that people like those I just mentioned feel toward Diddy is this. Sonny Williams, he's at one point, several years, by around 1997, 5, 6 years, he says the litigation goes on around this fiasco. It says, I'll give you $50,000 in response to Sonia Williams' death. And the implication that Sonny gives is that money was going to be used to donate to a foundation in her memory. And he movingly is sitting there wearing a shirt with her picture on it, by the way, as he's speaking. And he describes that as a slap in the face. And here now in 2024, 2025, more than a quarter of a century later, is clearly still irate about what he considered to have been an offer that amounted to a slap in the face. So there are lots of voices like that throughout the film, too. It's not just that we went out and found some of his friends and asked them who Diddy was and who he is now. There's certainly a lot more than that going on here. The friends that they find include Lee Davis, DJ Easy Lee, as apparently he is known, Rich Parker, a guy named Ron Lawrence, who was a classmate of Diddy's at Howard University and a producer who worked with him, Mel Love, who was an intern at Uptown Records. Uptown Records being an outfit that yields this fascinating personality, Al B. Sure, who is also a very prolific voice throughout the film, and someone who also has very legitimate reasons to absolutely despise Diddy, as he explains in the film. And so the other problem with a documentary like this that I think Diddy's legal team hints at is, gosh, this makes it hard to find an unbiased jury pool, doesn't it? Whenever the time comes for jury selection, might be the point at which this case is won or lost. I mean, maybe you find older potential jurors who don't themselves have any exposure to this kind of music, don't have any reason to really have any regard for Diddy, haven't listened to, Can't Stop, Won't Stop, and I'll Be Missing You, and all that stuff. They're not, blasting Tupac and Biggie in their cars, driving around town or whatever. Maybe that's part of the hope that you have in the wake of all this documentary noise that's coming out, all the news coverage. It just does seem to make it hard, for figures like this to find an unbiased jury, and which is another concern that Diddy's legal team airs in this defamation lawsuit. And it's interesting, and perhaps to the film's credit, that while Diddy just wants people, and his legal team want people to believe that all this documentary does is demonize him, to the contrary, I don't think that that's an entirely truthful appraisal of what the film does, because actually I was kind of surprised by the extent to which the film, though it airs monstrous allegations of the most heinous behavior imaginable, also does a little bit of work to bring some humanity to understanding how Diddy became who he apparently became. And again, this is where his childhood friend Tim Patterson, who describes him as having been monsterized, becomes a key figure and a key voice that is especially illuminating throughout this film. But as Patterson says, monsters are made. So a film that, again, we talked about this with the Prince thing. The Prince estate wants us to believe that it's just a salacious documentary that's doing nothing but digging up sleaze about Prince, when the truth is quite the contrary. Here, you have Patterson saying, I know Diddy's made a lot of terrible mistakes, but, monsters are made. Here's what happened in his childhood that could at least shed some light on how he became this monster. Patterson talks about explicit scenes that were commonplace in Diddy's childhood experience, illicit parties arranged by his mom that unfolded right before his eyes, with scenes of sex and drugs everywhere he turned as a little kid. His mom, Janice, is still around, still alive and kicking at 83 years old, by the way. They also, in what appears to be an effort to, at the initial stages of the documentary, bring some degree of humanity to understanding how Diddy became who he's become, speak with what they describe as a domestic violence and sex trafficking expert named Dr. Carolyn West, who says, quote, "We need to be asking the question, not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you." She later says that regardless of traumas in Diddy's childhood, he still needs to be held accountable for the misdeeds he committed in his adulthood, which is a really important point, because you're walking some really fraught ground when you're bringing humanity to a man who is under a federal indictment and more than 40 lawsuits for, again, truly horrific behavior that, it seems, ruined lives. It's no hyperbole in saying that. There are people who, are the terror that some of the folks who were spoken with in this documentary feel is quite palpable. West calls particular attention to the significance in Sean Combs' experience of having lost his father to, quote, some very violent and tragic circumstances. She goes on to observe that if you've lost a parent, there's a desire to belong to something bigger than yourself, to not be isolated, to belong to a group, to fit in. Tim Patterson says of the absence of a father figure in Diddy's life as a kid, why his dad wasn't there was a mystery to both of us. Sean, he says, had to learn about his dad through other fellas who came up during that time. Gene Deal also discusses the absence of Diddy's father in his childhood, and he describes Diddy's dad, whose name was Melvin, as, quote, allegedly a gangster, a hustler, and a player in the streets of New York. There was apparently this guy named Nicky Barnes, who's described in the film as a Harlem kingpin with whom Melvin allegedly was closely associated. Melvin starts snitching allegedly on some of his cohorts in the streets to a New York City cop. And the insinuation at the point at which that revelation is made is that Melvin Combs died a violent death as a result of snitching. Then there's also the bullying, apparently, that Diddy underwent as a child. There's a good deal of detail about this. Even not just in his childhood, but even into the late 1980s when he joins this outfit that Gene Deal calls the Same Gang. They sort of initiated him into the group by attacking him physically, which included apparently slamming him in the head with cakes at one point. Was one of the strange revelations made there. And Diddy is said to have, felt like, people saw him as a wimp, a sissy, a pushover, some kind of goofball, but then he calls himself Puff Daddy, and at that point he invents himself into this far grander figure worthy of the utmost regard and fear. And it is to that impulse that Dr. West speaks with the following quote, when she says, quote, some perpetrators are profoundly damaged individuals who, quote, feel very powerless. A way of feeling powerful is controlling and victimizing other people. And I do think that brings some light to Diddy's character in later stretches of his life. And the reason, as Dr. West importantly says, that Diddy must still be held accountable for his actions, regardless of all the details that I just discussed, is, guess what? None of this provides any consolation whatsoever for those whose lives may have been ruined by the actions described in the federal indictment and in the more than 40 lawsuits filed against him now. Plenty of people are bullied in childhood and don't go on to become narcissistic psychopaths, right? And we're all accountable for our own responses to whatever unresolved traumas fester back in the early stages of our lives. Okay, so it is at this point, as I'm watching this film, that a similar figure comes to mind, someone who is not at all mentioned. There's no regard for this man I'm about to mention in the documentary itself, but it certainly came to mind for me. As they're talking about this sort of inferiority complex that apparently Diddy's childhood experiences led him to develop, and the inflamed ego with which he responded to that set of circumstances, the person who came to mind for me is a guy named Phil Spector. Remember Phil Spector? Are you aware of Phil Spector? To this day, still probably a guy who was the most famous and influential record producer of all time. This guy co-wrote and produced Spanish Harlem, the Benny King hit of 1960. He co-wrote Be My Baby by the Ronettes, came out in 1963, produced that right as he's developing what became known as Phil Spector's Wall of Sound. Made the greatest Christmas album ever made, A Christmas Gift for You in 1963. You hear those songs every Christmas, everywhere you go. Even if you don't know it, you do. He co-wrote and produced the Righteous Brothers hit, You've Lost That Love and Feeling, in 1965, which went on to become the most played song on the radio of the entire 20th century. Okay, I found this little tidbit about You've Lost That Love and Feeling. BMI ranked the song as the most played song on American radio and television in the 20th century, having accumulated more than 8 million airplays by 1999 and nearly 15 million by 2011. It held that distinction of being the most played song for 22 years until 2019, when it was overtaken by Every Breath You Take, the 1983 hit by The Police, which coincidentally, as you probably know if you're watching this video, is a song that Diddy sampled with his 1997 hit with Faith Evans, I'll Be Missing You. The sort of Biggie tribute that was a smash hit and won numerous Grammys at the 40th Grammy Awards in 1998. I mentioned Phil Spector because listen to this snippet and tell me if you don't hear some similarity between these two figures. Diddy bullied, made to feel inferior, responds to that apparently with a kind of narcissistic egotism that spirals completely out of control in his adulthood to the point that it torments and destroys the lives of plenty of folks in his inner and orbit and beyond. Listen to this from Far Out magazine so you get a sense of why Phil Spector, in my mind, becomes a specter as I'm watching this documentary. Quote, he pulled a gun on Debbie Harry of Blondie, of Call Me and Heart of Glass fame, right? And pulled a gun on the Ramones and no doubt countless other artists he came into contact with. His obsession with guns reportedly began, listen closely here, back in 1958 when he was on tour with the Teddy Bears. He found himself alone in the bathroom of a rough and tumble bar, and when 4 men entered, they picked on him for his slight stature and urinated on him. Thereafter, he vowed never to be without protection again. In 2003, this story would come to its tragically forecast conclusion. Spector was at the House of Blues one night when he met model and actress Lana Clarkson. Later that night, the pair left together and entered Spector's limousine. A few hours later, Spector's driver called the police and said that his boss had informed him that he had just shot someone. When the cops arrived at his property, they found Lana Clarkson dead with a gunshot wound to her face. Spector protested his innocence. His story was that she was kissing the gun in a seductive act when she fired it. He asserted that it was an accidental suicide. While there is, in fact, evidence that suggests this might have been the case, a string of former sexual partners claimed that he had also pulled a gun on him, and his former behavior proved damning. I see a lot of likeness between the paths of Spector and Diddy. That to me is pretty illuminating of how someone whose path leads into the music industry becomes the kind of malevolent mogul that Spector was and that allegedly Diddy became as well. The question that I have, all of this said, as I'm watching this documentary, which I, again, have done 5 times now, is could NBC have done more to independently investigate the claims it makes in this film? Again, this has nothing to do with whether Diddy's guilty or his accusers are to be believed or anything like that. It's purely a question about the way that NBC practiced journalism here. Did they do it in such a way as to truly and completely protect themselves from the possibility of a defamation lawsuit like the one Diddy filed days ago for $100 million? And in that regard, the questions that I have in mind are, how does NBC specifically know the things their documentary alleges? Questions like, how do we know what we know, are among the most fundamental that any news organization asks itself before reporting on anything, okay? And here are some specific examples of what I'm talking about. And again, this is just watching the documentary within the context of the recently filed defamation lawsuit. These are the questions that came to mind for me, okay? Gene Deal at one point is asked if he himself ever saw Diddy, quote, be respectful with Kim Porter. Kim Porter, with whom Al B. Sure had a child named Quincy, who is himself now an actor and wonderful. It's just a wonderful story that he's found his own path in life as well. She ends up going on to have 3 kids, I believe, with Diddy himself. And Gene Deal is asked about, these allegations that Kim Porter was subject to domestic violence at the hands of Diddy. But specifically, the question is, Did you ever see Diddy, quote, be disrespectful with Kim Porter? Gene Deal responds by recounting a story of having been called to St. Luke's Hospital where he says Kim looked like she was bruised, quote, but she wasn't saying much of nothing. And again, watching this documentary within the context of this recently filed defamation suit, the question that comes to mind immediately for me is that, does that answer the question he was asked? I don't think it does. He was asked, did he ever see Diddy disrespect Kim? The story he tells here indicates that the answer to that question is probably no. Did NBC investigate Deal's story about the St. Luke's Hospital incident? That story does not include any testimony indicating that Gene Deal specifically witnessed Diddy do anything to Kim Porter. It's, she was sort of, the possibility of that was on the fringes of the experience that he recounts. So just just with regard to just practicing journalism, is this the kind of story that NBC confidently can run with and say, no, there's no chance of having been accused of defaming Diddy with an anecdote like this? Did NBC investigate this? If so, what did they find? This is the kind of thing that, again, in the aftermath of the defamation lawsuit, as I'm watching this documentary only then, it feels missing in the documentary. Maybe an independent investigator or an investigative journalist, people who have those kinds of investigative chops, which, as I said, are abundantly available to an outfit like NBC, and maybe have some facility on camera and can speak to the results of their investigative efforts, might have helped here. Might have helped, independently corroborate or debunk some of the claims, or many of the claims, perhaps made and allegations made throughout this documentary. Maybe this documentary, to protect itself from a defamation lawsuit like this, needed a narrator who could carry that kind of burden throughout the film and really start to connect dots and reveal to us at least what investigative efforts NBC independently engaged in as it dug into the allegations that this documentary airs. There's some of that, but not nearly, in my view, enough of it to protect them from a defamation lawsuit like the one Diddy just filed. We get then Lisa Bloom, a civil rights attorney who represented 11 victims of Jeffrey Epstein, who, of course, is a shadow that haunts this film as it progresses. She says in this documentary that she represents, quote, a victim who alleges that she also saw acts of violence with regard to Kim Porter. Again, this is part of that quote. She was horrified. It was appalling. She was threatened into not reporting it. Okay. So I'd like to know more as the viewer. And maybe it was incumbent upon NBC, if they could, to reveal more. Specifically, what did she see, and how can we corroborate her accounts of those events? Specifically, who intimidated her into silence and by what means? This is the kind of detail that the documentary doesn't frequently offer, in my experience watching it. And it's also the kind of detail that probably could have been revealed over a course of a few seconds. It wouldn't have added much to the film's 90-minute runtime. If the answer to the questions I just asked is that, well, we couldn't go there because it's evidence pertaining to pending court cases, then isn't that why you wait until Diddy is convicted? And at that point, you can really dig in, right? You can investigate and provide answers to the questions I just asked. And the threat of a defamation lawsuit at that point is going to have much less punch to it. If the guy's found guilty of these charges, what argument can he have if you're merely digging into allegations documented in a court proceeding, allegations that are bolstered by evidence revealed in a court proceeding that a judge has reviewed and determined to be evidence documenting this man's guilt? Then you can really dig in and really use those investigative chops to nail this case down ironclad. Gene Deal then comes back and tells a story that, again, doesn't include him witnessing Diddy doing anything to Kim, but instead is something about how he's outside a presidential suite. It's alleged that Kim Porter is in this suite with Diddy. And then he says, and listen to this language, quote, and you could tell that she, and then he just trails off. And picks up again with a different quote and says, quote, he may have been roughing, and then he trails off again. And then he picks up again with this. I'd be like, yo, you alright? He played too much. And the questions I have here are, what did he notice about Kim Porter in that moment that made him ask if she was all right? How is it possible that, did they get any specific like physical observation out of Gene Deal? But what did he see in Kim Porter? Was her face like bruised up, or what caused him to inquire as to her well-being in that moment? They don't even reveal that much in this anecdote. Was there anyone else in the hotel room besides Diddy, or was she truly in there alone with this man? Was NBC able to just go out and document a hotel stays that Diddy had with Kim Porter? I mean, even just that much, and saying, yeah, he was on the road with her here, there, and in this moment and that moment. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that I wouldn't have minded seeing NBC dig into. Again, not because the believability of the accusers is at stake. That's not the point. The point is, what more could NBC have done to protect itself from the threat of a defamation lawsuit? And it seems like doesn't seem like difficult legwork to perform. All NBC provides, after letting all this insinuation fly, is a dark screen punched out with white copy reading, quote, "There was no evidence that Kim Porter was the victim of domestic violence." And that feels lazy and rushed to me, almost like a cop-out. Why are we hearing all these things then, if NBC at the same time acknowledges that there's no evidence corroborating these claims? And this is what Diddy's legal team is that's the ground they're standing on here with this defamation lawsuit. They specifically say in that lawsuit, quote, "In the purported documentary, defendants accuse Mr. Combs of horrible crimes knowing there is no evidence to support them." It would, look, I'm no lawyer, but dude, it would seem that NBC, again, what did they say about these claims about Kim Porter? There was no evidence that Kim Porter was the victim of domestic violence. And Diddy's legal team is saying they knew there was no evidence to support these claims. That's when you start to wonder if NBC has a problem, if they might have a problem here. And the implications of that, if, God forbid for NBC, they do have a problem, on the future of documentaries like this could be rather dramatic. After that black screen, we meet someone named Kim Osorio. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing her name, Osorio. She's described as a hip-hop journalist who tells us, and this is where I'm like, I'm listening to something like, really? Is there, and maybe the problem here is, as we all know, people coming forward, and Lisa Bloom does a masterful job at one point in the film of explaining the difficulty of this and the consequence and the challenge of it, and saying, yeah, I was there and I witnessed these things. When you're doing so in the face of a man of seemingly infinite wealth and power is a terrifying prospect. And maybe that was part of the challenge that, at least before Diddy's actually convicted in court, NBC had trouble overcoming. And I mention that because this is all we get out of this hip-hop journalist, Kim Osorio, which is, well, there were whispers maybe of things that were happening behind the scenes. That doesn't sound like evidence of much to me. Whispers, maybe. There was a little blip of coverage, she says, but nothing beyond that. And then, weirdly, I would say, after she says these things, the film goes on to quote Osorio talking about how hardworking Diddy was, and then cuts right to a clip in which Diddy himself is claiming in a public appearance that he works 20 hours a day. She later, Osorio, says she herself went to lots of Diddy's parties in the 1990s, but seems to stipulate that she herself was never present for any of what she calls, quote, the after parties, which she says were something that I had heard before, that maybe there were orgies happening. Okay, so this is someone who didn't see any of what she's discussing in the film. And again, before Diddy's actually convicted in court, the problem for NBC might be they're not going to find many people who feel empowered to come forward and talk about this stuff. And maybe what results from this defamation lawsuit, perhaps it's just determined to be a frivolous, silly, a denial of accountability by Diddy and his legal team. But if it's determined to be anything more than that, maybe this is part of the lesson that NBC learns is, perhaps we wait. Maybe we don't rush into, satisfy what Diddy's legal team describes as an appetite for scandal here, and we wait a bit for this to play out in court. Then we can really flex some investigative muscle. And again, I mean, that seems especially true when we acknowledge the likelihood of a conviction coming down here. Again, that seems mathematically, at the very least, pretty great, right? You've got a 14-page long federal indictment and dozens of separate lawsuits filed against the guy. There are some compelling witnesses here, given what I just said about how difficult, how challenging, how terrifying it can be for victims of this kind of abuse to come forward in any sort of public manner. You got to hand it to this person named Sarah Rivers, who worked with Diddy on MTV's Making the Band 2, who shows her face with her name, not disguising herself or her voice. She's right on camera, and you've got to admire her fearlessness. Her account of being groped by Diddy is deeply disturbing, and she bursts into tears as she's recounting that story. And it's one of those moments in the documentary where it takes your breath away when you see what's at stake for the people who are coming forward. It's a truly sobering moment. Even more so is this a person who's only identified as Ashley, who's absolutely terrified of Diddy. It's quite apparent. She says she's lived in isolation for years, in terror of the possibility of, quote, them coming to get me for speaking. She says she no longer trusts anyone. She's clearly shaken to the core of her being. And scenes and disclosures like this make the documentary as disturbing as a documentary can get. You just want to give these people a big, tight hug. I mean, it's like you feel helpless before these testimonies, because you're just, there's so much pain that's so evident there, and you yourself are powerless to do anything for these people as they're suffering right before your eyes. It's a very uncomfortable experience. It struck me that this film does a better job documenting at one point Diddy's demand for a slice of cheesecake than it does documenting most of the allegations that it allows to air. We get video at one point of Diddy making this demand for a slice of cheesecake. We get video of people around him saying they're going to walk for many hours from where they were to Brooklyn to get him his slice of cheesecake. We get Osorio and Tim Patterson both commenting specifically on the cheesecake incident. And so we have more than 3 sources corroborating the same set of facts, compounded by witness testimony and video documentation. Man, they nailed down that cheesecake clue. That's a kind of corroborative effort that maybe might have helped protect the producers of this film against this kind of defamation lawsuit. But at the center of those efforts is a slice of cheesecake. Then Elisa Bloom makes allegations about someone named Dawn Richard, after which NBC flips to another black screen with white words indicating that nothing she has just said has been proven in a court of law. We also get a black screen featuring a statement by Combs' attorney, Erica Wolf, disputing her claims and alleging that she's just making them for money. Right. And that is one of the laziest defenses of a celebrity that we ever hear, right? Oh, they're just saying this for money. Okay, that's great. But can you now please directly address the actual allegation that's been made rather than just stomping on the gold digger pedal? Can we actually talk about what is said, the substance of what's been said here? You really become exasperated after we have seen so many of these scandals break over the heads of so many celebrities who are just accused of being gold diggers. And this is part of what Lisa Bloom discusses that's at stake for these people who come forward. But why does NBC just settle for airing an accusation and then saying, well, this hasn't been proven, or Combs' legal team denies this? Did NBC conduct any independent investigation of Bloom's claims about Dawn Richard? If so, what did they find? Who did they speak with? How did they uncover evidence to either corroborate or debunk her claims about Dawn Richard? Why is none of that done? Or at least if it was done, we aren't told about it as a viewer of the documentary. And again, this is just about them maybe leaving themselves vulnerable to this kind of defamation lawsuit. It has nothing to do with the believability of the people. That's not the discussion here. It's just, man, as I'm watching this after this defamation lawsuit comes out, I can see where maybe they left themselves exposed to this kind of thing. And Epstein, of course, comes up, and there certainly are shades of Epstein throughout this documentary. In particular, an especially fearless voice in Ariel Mitchell-Kidd, who I mentioned earlier. She identifies cohorts like Christina Coram and Shane Pierce as figures sent out to recruit girls for Diddy, which is precisely the operation Epstein had going with the likes of Ghislaine Maxwell, right, who's now sitting in prison having been convicted of those offenses. There's no arguing the facts as they pertain to her, right? There are no defamation suits forthcoming because a court determined to her to be guilty of the charges she faced. So whoever's doing a doc, if anyone is, about Maxwell, can do so much more safely and probably without much concern at all of the defamation lawsuit, as long as they stick to the facts as they were documented in court proceedings, right? And this is when, the documentary at that point does at least make some gesture toward the kind of investigative journalism that to me felt lacking throughout. Ariel Mitchell Kidd, who clearly fears no one and is an especially emphatic voice in this film, an especially ardent supporter of Diddy's alleged victims, says that this Ashley person we alluded to earlier, she suffers a terribly abusive incident. I mean, the details of which are at times gruesome, profoundly disturbing. And it is reported at that point in the film that the Contra County Police Department out in California released a statement confirming that Ashley did file a police report specifically on March 28th, 2018, but that the department later found her allegations to be unfounded. It's a weird moment in the film when the police officer who shows up at this scene doesn't seem particularly interested in helping her, and almost seem to have an agenda. It's another very dark episode in this documentary. NBC then, making it all the darker, I would say, discloses in another black screen that they themselves reached out to police requesting those records and their request was denied. Okay, great. Letting us in on the investigative efforts that they put into this film. That's good stuff. That's the kind of stuff that I would have loved to see more of in the film, only to make clear that they did everything they could to protect themselves against a defamation lawsuit like this. The documentary soon thereafter discloses that production reached out to Shane Pierce for comment, but received no response. Good. That's more of the kind of independent legwork that they probably needed to do and sort of parade throughout the film to protect themselves from a defamation suit like this. The production team also apparently reached out to this Christina Coram person for a statement and got one in which she said she's not only innocent, but that she doesn't know Diddy, which to me seems like red meat for any worthwhile investigative journalist, because there are accusers in this documentary who specifically recall seeing her on the scene while abuse was unfolding. So just reaching out to the accused for statements is merely the beginning of the work that needed to be done to nail down the claims in this film. It seems quite possible that in Coram's case, NBC could have done plenty to nail down the connection between Coram and Diddy on their own. More than just an accuser saying, yeah, I saw her there. I mean, times when they probably could document time Coram and Diddy spent together, where Coram was at a given time and place where Diddy was also present. Probably more could have been done, and maybe they did do more, but they just didn't include those details in the documentary. Who knows? Did they seek and find any evidence contradicting her claim to not know him? That's all I'm asking. I mean, it doesn't seem, based on the documentary's revelations about her relationship with Diddy, that would have been very hard to do. This documentary discloses nothing of that nature. Nothing. And then, at this point, I start to wonder. They keep alluding to the producers and what they did and who they went to for information. Are they only producers, or are they investigative journalists? Are they being asked to wear both hats? If so, did that put them in a fair position? Again, the production company itself is named in Diddy's lawsuit. This is not just a lawsuit against NBCUniversal and Peacock. It's also against Ample Productions. So they have skin in this game too. Where the film, I think, becomes especially reckless is when it turns its attention to the death of Kim Porter at age 47, tragically young. And the coroner documents her cause of death as being pneumonia. At which point, here comes Ariel Mitchell again saying, who is dying? She's looking around going, who is dying from pneumonia? Well, I mean, according to the American Lung Association, I looked it up, 50,000 people die from pneumonia annually. I myself have had pneumonia twice, and yes, I survived it, but I also have people in my family who have died from pneumonia. in my family. Mitchell says, people get pneumonia every day and don't die. While that's true, it's of absolutely no relevance because 50,000 people a year do die of pneumonia. Mitchell's statements here are evidence of nothing and might even be characterized as wild, reckless, uninformed speculation. Why would NBC air statements that quite clearly can be characterized as reckless and provably false? Maybe she isn't aware that people do die of pneumonia, but again, that is evidence of nothing as it pertains to the death of Kim Porter. NBC does at least allow Kim Porter's family the dignity of having released a statement from her children in which they not only deny that there was any foul play as far as they're concerned with respect to Kim Porter's death, but also say that allegations to that effect are very hurtful to them. So I commend NBC for allowing them that voice in this very painful episode in the documentary. It's at this point that they start to try and connect some dots with respect to all the death surrounding Diddy. Al B. Shure's accusations about Kim Porter's death are aired. He is convinced that she was murdered. At one point, he alludes to her murder and then looks at the interviewer and says, "Am I supposed to say allegedly?" So Andre Harrell at Uptown Records, he dies of a heart attack. Heavy D at Uptown Records, he dies of a heart attack. NBC reveals authorities, quote, did not consider either death to be suspicious. Okay, Kim Porter dies of pneumonia. Al B. Shure has this episode in 2022 where he describes as the third time in his life where he collapses to the ground. He had some surgeries leading up to that. I can't remember what the health cause was for this particular collapse, but he's on a ventilator, I think he says, for 33 days or something like that, and almost dies. He's convinced that various associates of Diddy's attempted to murder him during this episode. And it's at this point where Al B. Shure says, why is everybody dead? Which is a perfectly reasonable question, but the question also in and of itself is evidence of nothing. And so this is where I'm like, oh man, with this defamation lawsuit hanging over this documentary like the sword of Damocles now, that's the kind of stuff that jumped out at me. Now, there's someone named Milo Morales who does provide eyewitness testimony to physical abuse of another former pop star who, as far as I can see, only came out with one record back in 2006. Her name is Cassie Ventura. This happened during the 2010 Grammy Awards, where she talks about, I think, sharing a room with Cassie. Diddy bursts into the room furious in the middle of the night because apparently Cassie went to some party. They go off into some side room. She emerges from that room, clearly having been physically assaulted, bruises and bleeding and stuff like that. And Mila describes in a frenzy packing her bags and getting her the hell out of there and getting her to safety. That's very compelling testimony. And Milo Morales struck me as do all the accusers in this film being deeply credible. This isn't about their credibility. It's about the extent to which NBC protected itself against a lawsuit alleging defamation. So, could NBC have proceeded in a bit more of a responsible manner journalistically? Possibly. And if that's the case, then this documentary, this is why this matters, as far as I'm concerned. They risk doing a disservice to Diddy's victims by merely airing allegations without apparently doing much to investigate them independently, beyond just showing selected passages from criminal complaints or black and white screens, alleging a lack of evidence to support claims made or statements made by Diddy's legal representation. I struggle to believe that competent legal counsel advised NBC that was enough to cover them against a defamation suit. To be clear again, the charges against Diddy in both the federal indictment and the dozens of lawsuits are absolutely horrific. And his legal team's assertion that his accusers are just in it for the money, again, it's that kind of boilerplate defense of celebrities that doesn't address the substance of the allegation, right? And again, as I said, it's indescribably difficult for victims to come forward, and those who do have the courage to do so in this documentary are to be celebrated for their courage. Which is all the more reason why some independent investigative journalism was especially needed in a documentary like this. Listen to all that's at stake. you know, you got to dig and corroborate, and it needs to be more than just, well, there's no evidence to support this, or here's what Combs's lawyer says, there needed, in my view, to be more work done investigatively and strung throughout this film. I didn't see enough of that in this documentary myself. It seems pretty clear that Diddy has a great deal of problems ahead, but NBC might have left themselves a little more vulnerable to just this kind of defamation suit than they intended. And if they do, again, land in hot water over this, I just wonder how that might change the approach that media companies take to documentaries like this going forward. Might they just be much more careful? Or might there be a cooling off period during which we don't see many, if any, of these music docs about troubled artists and producers and the like? We'll see. It seems certain that there's a great deal more to come out of this case in the months and years ahead. I'll probably have more to say about this as those developments emerge. Definitely another one of those stay tuned situations that I've made videos on in recent months here at The Curious Listener. Check out the description for links to stories about the defamation suit, links to the federal indictment, 14 pages long. Read it for yourself, and you can see how chilling the accusations are. Check out the documentary. Just be warned, it's some dark stuff. So bring all the wherewithal and psychological resourcefulness you can summon, because it's a very difficult watch.